To order. Good morning and welcome to the December 14th Planning Commission meeting. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home and Save Lives order. This format enables the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by a work session on the Middle Housing Code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now. Raise your hand now virtually to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. Number one, for those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the blue hand icon. Number two, for those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. When the public comment begins, our meeting moderator will announce the next two speakers at a time. When it's your turn, the moderator will announce your name and unmute your microphone. Public comment is limited to 10 minutes, so your time to speak will be based on the number of people signed up to speak. Finally, I want to thank everyone again for their patience, flexibility, and good humor as we work within this new virtual meeting format. As always, feel free to contact staff if there is testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get staff in a different manner for us. So with that, moving on to agenda item A. Let's see, Kristen has not joined us, but I'm sure she will in stride. Agenda item A, public comment.
So we have Ed Lowry and Bill Aspergen that both have their hands raised.
Okay, terrific. So public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topics except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. The Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes at the beginning of our meeting for public comment. Generally, the time limit for public comment is 3 minutes. We have 2 people signed up currently. I think still 3 minutes is probably a good idea. The planning, let's see, we're going to, that's what we're going to do based on the number of people. Try to keep your comments around 3 minutes. As a reminder, your hand must be raised in the queue for public comment. When it's your turn and your microphone has been unmuted by staff, please state your name clearly before beginning your comments. Staff will let you know when your time is up. When your time has concluded, the moderator will mute your microphone and move on to the next speaker. So now, moderator, can we begin with public comments?
We have Ed Lowry up, and then we will have Bill Aspergen after him.
Go ahead, Ed.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just actually sent a email to Ms. Hanson. I don't know whether she got it. It was only about an hour ago. I have been an opponent of 3 issues which have not been settled yet by the commission. One is having to, all of them are actions that are asked for by RNS management. One of them is moving a traffic diverter on Fairway Loop. One of them is a site adjustment for Fairway Loop apartments. And one of them is for a zone change at the corner of Southwood Lane and Fairway Loop.
Ed, I'm going to interrupt you right now. We cannot listen to your testimony on that because a public hearing is scheduled for that those items later in the week. I believe it's tomorrow evening.
The only reason I am
Ed, you really we can't, because we're a quasi judicial group, and anything you tell us now is ex parte contact. And
it does not have to do with evidence for any of those issues.
well, it is an item that is before the commission later this week, and therefore I'm going to ask Lauren Summers for some clarification here. Yes, Lauren.
All right.
Thank you, Chair Amy. If I may, I had a chance to review Mr. Lowry's email, and it is specific to a conflict of interest that Commissioner Taylor has with regard to the RNS applications, because she represents the applicant on those applications. And she is aware of that conflict of interest. She has provided a written statement of a conflict of interest to the Althea Sullivan, who's the primary planner on the project. And she will appear at the very beginning of the public hearing meeting tomorrow night, declare her actual conflict of interest, and then not participate in the discussion or decision on the appeal.
Okay, Mr. Lowry, thank you for participating. Is that satisfactory to you?
Actually, it's not. And the reason why it's not is that these hearings have been ongoing, and nothing has ever been said at any of the hearings before this time about the conflict of interest, which seems obvious at the beginning, namely that a commissioner is also advocating for an applicant. I think it's a commissioner problem, not her problem necessarily. The commission needs to make sure that anybody who has an apparent conflict of interest is cleared, and in some way or other is clear to the public before any hearing goes on.
Correct.
And so I am very nervous about the complicity of the commission, if you will, in this matter.
I hear your comment. I'm going to turn again to Lauren Summers.
Thank you again, Commissioner Ramey. Just to be clear, for the commissioners and for the folks listening, there are a number of applications that were submitted by RNS Management. The only application that will actually come before the commission is the zone change, the appeal of the hearings official's denial of the zone change application, for which you will hold a public hearing tomorrow night and then start deliberations on Thursday. The other two applications, the Planning Commission will never see because of the types of applications that they are and the process that the City of Eugene has in its code for processing those types of applications. So Commissioner Taylor has a conflict of interest in the application that comes to the Planning Commission because she would otherwise be in a position to take action and discuss that application in her capacity as a planning commissioner. The other two applications never come to the Planning Commission, so she would not have that opportunity to discuss or make a decision on those applications in her capacity as a planning commissioner. And we can talk about all of this more tomorrow night if the Planning Commission thinks that would be helpful.
All right. Thank you, Lauren Summers. With that, I think we're ready to move on to our second commenter.
We have Bill Aspergren up next.
Bill, when you're ready, state your name and make your comment.
Okay, can you hear me? I think I'm unmuted now.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. My name's Bill Aspergren. I'm in Ward 3, and I want to comment about the House Bill 2001 project. I've been following House Bill 2001 since it was proposed in 2019. In the very first sentence of the AIS for this meeting, Terry Harding states, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2001 in 2019 with the goal of increasing housing supply and choice in residential neighborhoods across the state. This is a fair statement of the purpose of 2001. And you might note that affordability, inclusion, exclusion, equitability, they're not mentioned in this, okay? Now, I've also been following and observing the Healthy Democracy meetings, including all panel and steering committee meetings. I think the 29 panelists have done a good job defining general or guiding principles. And Healthy Democracy's Lynn Davis said that they would be used to direct, quote, how the city should write code to comply with House Bill 2001. Excuse me. I feel there are two areas where the panel should have more information. One is detailed financial information relating to the cost to develop, rent, and own middle housing. I sent several documents that dealt with financial feasibility of Portland's residential infill project and information about the actual price of townhouses in Eugene to Healthy Democracy, then refused to provide these to the panel or even to the steering committee because it was outside information. If there's any panel members listening to this, Lynn has my email address, and if you'd like to see this, just get it from him and contact me. The second thing, I think there should have been more in the principles about neighborhood compatibility. And now that LCDC has finalized the administrative rules, I think these should immediately be sent to the Healthy Democracy panel. And even better, the 14-page APG memo that was in the AIS should immediately go to the panel so they will have time to actually review and understand the House Bill 2001 details. However, I am very curious how guiding principles will be integrated into the code. And I really think the panelists especially are owed an explanation of how this will occur. And I think you, the Planning Commission, should today ask the staff how they're going to integrate the guiding principles into the implementation of House Bill 2001 Middle Housing Code, and do it avoiding appeals. I think appeals are a significant problem, and the legislation does not allow the city to adopt standards or requirements that that result in unreasonable cost or delay in the development of housing. I think at this stage, we need a wider public engagement, and decisions need to be made quickly, such as lot size, attached, detached, others. Neighbors need input to make sure that there's a transition and compatibility between middle housing and built-up community. Making these decisions without public input right now, I'm afraid is going to create problems. So that's all I have to say at this stage of the game, and I hope I haven't run over too much. Are you going to mute me, or will I mute myself here?
I believe we will mute you, Bill. Thank you for your comments.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, is anyone else in line to make a public comment?
There are no more hands up.
Thank you, Amy. With that, we're going to close the public comment. And I think Mr. Aspergren's comments will be covered as part of our discussion. I certainly hope we will get to that level of detail at some point. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Terry Harding. And Terry, you are up.
Great, thank you. I've unmuted myself. Hopefully you can all see me. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, somebody give me a sign if something's not showing up correctly. But good morning, commissioners. As I've been introduced, my name is Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner for community planning and design and the city's project manager for Middle Housing Code Amendments, also known as implementing House Bill 2001. Today, we're excited to bring you an update on public engagement activities for the project, as well as an overview of the technical work that has begun and will ramp up in the new year. We have a lot to share with you today, and some of the information was just gathered last week. So consider this an introduction to a lot of content that you have about a month to reflect on before we meet again on middle housing at your January 12th meeting. To get us started, we created this word cloud of the best outcomes from group conversations held with the city boards and commissions and local partners this fall. When asked the question, what are your hopes or the best possible outcomes of allowing more types of housing in more places across Eugene, as required by the House bill? The words used most often to answer this question were inclusive, housing, walkability, affordability, sustainability, diversity, opportunity, and equity, among others. As we continue moving toward a staff recommendation for guiding values and principles for implementing the House bill, these words and those generated by our Equity Roundtable and Healthy Democracy panel will provide us inspiration. For today's presentation, we have a middle housing refresher, which I've already started for you, and then a public involvement update from city staff, Sophie McGinley and Jennifer Knapp. And we'll break for questions after each of us give our piece. A healthy democracy presentation from Lynn Davis and two guest panelists, Sam and Hunter. And our last speaker will be Matt Hasty, our consultant project manager, who will give an update on state rules and minimum standards and the team's work on neighborhood context study and a preliminary list of design and code concepts. This list was attached to your packet and outlines places where the city has choices in adopting new code for middle housing and where the rules have less flexibility. As I mentioned, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A after each presenter, which Chair Ramey will moderate. The goals of the Middle Housing Project are to implement the House bill, further equity and long-term housing affordability, and enable more housing to be built in a greater diversity of forms. The high-level requirements of the bill are to, by June 30th, 2022, adopt regulations that allow a duplex to be built on every lot in the city where a single detached house can be built, and to allow triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and row houses in residential zones that allow single detached houses. This slide shows a zoning map of Eugene and illustrates that the House bill will affect the community very broadly. We will be amending our R1 cream-colored zone, which covers a large majority of residential areas in Eugene, as well as R2, R3, R4, and many special area zones to allow easier construction of middle housing. Nearing the end of 2020, we have completed our first phase of outreach, and Sophie and Jen will tell you about it shortly. We're heading into phase 2, design and code concepts, which you'll begin to hear about today and will be the focus of broad public outreach in the new year. Then we'll spend time writing code and policies, vetting those with the community, and then finally take the code and policy language through the local adoption process. Our final deadline is June 30th, 2022 to have local code adopted that complies with the House bill. I'm going to pause for any general questions you have about the timeline or process before turning it over to Sophie to talk about public involvement. So Commissioner Ramey, if there are any general questions here, we can take them.
I don't see anyone's hands are up either virtually or otherwise. So I think we can move ahead. Great.
Okay, then we'll go to the next slide. Public involvement plan, and Sophie, let me know when I need to advance your slide. Go ahead.
Great, thanks Terry, and hello commissioners. The last time we saw you, you approved the project's public involvement plan. This project is new and different. Oregon is the first state to ever pass legislation requiring more housing types to be allowed in more places, and Eugene is a part of that. Then, with the coronavirus completely changing how we do things and the social justice movement demanding we examine systemic racism and inequities, we committed to a public engagement focused on equity and inclusion. You're going to hear about engagement that's also new and different. I just want to preface by saying that the new outreach is an addition to some tried and true outreach. No engagement methods are being replaced. Rather, they are being added to, with the exception of large in-person public meetings due to public health concerns. You're going to hear about the work done so far, our public web pages, social media, boards and commissions roundtable, local partners roundtable, equity roundtable, student outreach, and the Healthy Democracy panel. It's all exciting and it's been a lot of work, and it's just the beginning of public engagement for this project. So let's dive into work that's already underway. 2020 is the year of going digital. We have developed 4 project fact sheets translated into Spanish, a comprehensive FAQ sheet coming soon, a project webpage with tons of information, an Engage Eugene page with opportunities for folks to share input and ask questions, monthly project updates to our 19,000 Huge Planning newsletter subscribers, a new presence on Instagram, and a project interested parties list. With things like social media, we've been able to share crucial information in a concise and often fun way. For example, pictured here is an Instagram takeover that we did in partnership with a national organization to talk about the public involvement plan. Now that the state has finalized its House Bill 2001 rules, the Engage Eugene page and webpage will receive big updates coming early 2021. So stay tuned for more. In addition to online engagement, we engaged with folks from city-recognized boards and commissions, including representatives from the Planning Commission. Then there were representatives from Sustainability Commission, Human Rights Commission, Historic Preservation Board, and the Housing Policy Board. This first phase of public engagement focused on developing guiding values and principles to guide the technical phase of the project. In order to develop those guiding values and principles, we asked the roundtables to share their worst and best outcomes of allowing more housing types to be built in more places. Themes and highlights from the Boards and Commissions Roundtable include planning for equity, affordability, and sustainability for all residents as we implement the House bill, as well as going beyond the regulatory requirements to consider incentives and programs that can help more people achieve housing stability. The day after the Boards and Commissions Roundtable, we met with representatives from local partners. Participants include a variety of local stakeholders, including Better Housing Together, the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, Better Eugene Springfield Transportation, 1,000 Friends of Oregon, Walkable Eugene Citizens Advisory Network, Lane County Home Builders, AARP, and the Neighborhood Leaders Council. We asked the local partners roundtable the same questions to share their worst and best outcomes of allowing more housing types in more places. Themes and highlights included equity, affordability, and sustainability, along with a desire to innovate and communicate the benefits of more housing options to the broader community. This group also expressed a hope to go further than the requirements of the House bill in responding to the housing crisis. Both roundtables will meet another 1 to 2 times in the new year to provide input on design and code concepts. The last piece of the public engagement I'll be sharing is something new, engagement with students. Every fall, the University of Oregon offers an undergraduate class to students wanting to work on real projects with the city called Real World Eugene. Terry and I partnered with 4 students, pictured here, Darian, Brianna, Cody, and Cameron, to involve young adults in the middle housing process. The students conducted focus groups, sent out a survey, and compiled recommendations for how the city can best reach young adults. The survey received 137 responses from local community members under 25 and highlighted themes of sustainability, safety, and equity. The young adult voice is one that is typically underrepresented in this room, and we are so grateful for the work done by Darian, Brianna, Cody, and Cameron. Now I'll pass it on to Jen to tell you about the work of the Equity Roundtable.
Thank you, Sophie, and hello, commissioners. The Equity Roundtable was based on the equity panel that was assembled for the Climate Action Plan. The city has partnered with Dr. Alain Rey Santos, who is facilitating the meetings with her team. 8 nonprofits that represent or work with BIPOC and other underrepresented communities have chosen participants from their organizations. The intent is to provide an equity lens to the project and hear from individuals that tend to not participate in government processes. The roundtable has met twice and will meet 2 to 3 more times throughout the project, as well as participating in one-on-one interviews. Themes from this group include participants' experiences with housing discrimination, racial profiling, accessibility concerns, needs for multi-generational households, and giving renters more housing options they can afford. And now there's time for some questions on the outreach that we've discussed so far.
Okay, commissioners, do we have any questions? All right. I am not seeing any hands raised, virtually or otherwise. So Terry, I think we can proceed. I think we may have questions as we go along here. Something may occur to us as we go.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we have our Healthy Democracy guests on yet. So we are very much ahead of schedule and might need to jump ahead and do our technical piece first. Would that be okay with you, Matt? On there?
Yes.
Okay. And I'll
Good thing I jumped on early.
gotta be nimble. All right, let me find my screen again to share. And we will put it in large format and go here. Okay, you're on.
Awesome. All right. So my name's Matt Hasty, not actually Housey. And I'm with Angela Planning Group. I'll say a little bit more about just our firm and kind of our role in this work in a moment. But in terms of a technical overview, we'll talk about the state rules and some minimum compliance standards. We won't go into that in great detail, but we'll kind of hit some highlights of that. Talk a little bit about the context study work that we've been doing in partnership with the city and other members of our team, and then talk about initial work on the design and code concepts task. So next one, thank you. So in terms of the state rules and some of the minimum compliance standards, you may kind of be aware of a lot of this, but the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission did adopt a model code and a set of administrative rules to implement House Bill 2001 just last week on December 9th. For folks who had been kind of following that closely up to that point, there were a few tweaks to the rules based on discussion between the last couple of LCDC meetings there. And so I'll just kind of hit a few highlights. One, these rules are geared in large part towards development feasibility and as kind of embedded in the legislation, not causing unreasonable cost and delay on development of middle housing types. They are fairly prescriptive in terms of a lot of the different types of allowable regulations that local governments can apply, but they do allow some local flexibility in a number of different ways. I'll talk about that as I move forward here. A number of different types of housing standards, middle housing standards, particularly those related to duplexes, are often linked to standards that a city already applies to or would apply to single family detached homes. So a number of those rule provisions say you can essentially apply the same types of standards, let's say, to duplexes that you apply to single family detached homes. You can't treat those two things differently. That's not the case everywhere, but that's the case in a number of places. And then for a number of the middle housing types, particularly kind of the other plexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhomes, the model code includes a limited set of design standards that were essentially vetted through the rulemaking process by DLCD staff and consultants in terms of meeting that requirement that they not result in unreasonable cost and delay. So they're kind of there in the model code for cities to use as they see fit. If cities want to use something different, that's sort of one thing to look at in terms of what's already kind of gone through that vetting process. And again, I'll talk about kind of the idea of alternative standards a little later. So those are just some, again, kind of highlights, knowing that we could get way down into the weeds if we wanted to on those OARs. So in terms of our firm, so again, I work for Angela Planning Group, and we have several other partners on this team. Sarah Architects, I think a lot of you are familiar with them through previous work on the River Road project. Cogito, I'm sure you're familiar with them in terms of doing community engagement work there. And then Echo Northwest, which is an economic analysis firm. So that's the members of the consulting team. And so we are working sort of hand in hand with staff on this project to evaluate different options on how to update your code ultimately to implement HB 2001 to ensure consistency with the requirements and the goals of that legislation and of the administrative rules that have been drafted. So you received in your packet an initial memo from us related to design and code concepts, kind of gives you a sense of where some of the flexibility lies, where some of the options or choices lie in terms of different types of standards. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Our firm and that team that I just described a moment ago, with the exception of Cogito, also assisted DLCD on developing the model code for middle housing. So we've been working with the state for the last 10 or 11 months on that process. So that's, I guess, hopefully you all will benefit from some lessons learned by us in working with them on that project. We're pretty familiar with the OARs, clearly with the model code, and just generally with the process and discussion that they went through on that process. I was the project manager for that, and I sat in on all of the, and helped present information on all of the technical advisory committee meetings for the model code. We're also, again, working with your staff just to support the engagement processes that are currently underway and will continue to be underway through this process, particularly in terms of preparing materials that you all can use to talk to people about what you're doing and query them on their priorities and opinions. We helped out with the fact sheets that went out earlier in this process. And we're just kind of available to provide whatever strategic advice we can where needed and requested. And we really kind of enjoying the relationship. We've worked for the city of Eugene on a number of occasions over the years. I actually also managed the process of developing a set of form-based code regulations for the Walnut Station area. Our firm worked on a code audit about a year ago related to kind of all forms of housing there. So we've done a lot of work over the years, and we really enjoy working with your staff. It's a great collaborative relationship in terms of working on this project. So it's probably more than you needed to know about me and our firm or our team. This is just kind of the schedule for our work and the main components of it. So, kicked off the project back in September, put together with the city, I would call it kind of an engagement work plan about, how we'd work together in terms of supporting you all on those engagement processes. There's an economic analysis task. There's a certain amount of that that's part of this I guess, contract that we have. But then Echo Northwest also has some additional work they're doing that they're contracting separately for that's related to the work that I'm managing. But that's why you see that kind of grayed out there. So they're doing that both sort of separately, but then tied together with this work. I'll talk about that context study work in a moment. I think that's the next slide. So we're kind of wrapping up that piece of the puzzle, and then are kind of well into the design and code concepts work, but still have a fair bit of work left to do to kind of flesh out those design and code concepts. Again, we're helping prepare materials to support the healthy democracy process, but it's not part of our contract. It's a separate one. So that's why you see that also kind of grayed out there. Again, supporting community outreach throughout. Once we have talked about and had a fair bit of discussion about those design and code concepts, we will move into starting to draft some potential code provisions or code language related to middle housing. And then the kind of final product from our team for this project will be a hearings ready set of code amendments. They won't get adopted as part of this phase. You've got another year after we finish our work to adopt middle housing code provisions, but we'll get you sort of as far along as we can in a pretty compressed period of time. So we'll have that for you, but there will be a lot of time to kind of talk through those things in more detail as you move forward. So, and I would also say, Terry, feel free to interrupt me or add on if I forget anything or miss anything, or you can't kick me under a table, so I can't let you do that, but virtually speaking. So context study summary. This is work that was primarily done by Sarah Architects on our team, again, working with your staff. So we looked at 4 kind of typical types of neighborhoods that are common, and development patterns that are common throughout Eugene. Historic pre-war grid, kind of post-war expansion, what we called urban transition, hilly, and cul-de-sac. That's how we categorize these different neighborhoods. And in this work, we also identified specific neighborhoods that are examples of these different types or typologies of neighborhoods. Each of these types of neighborhoods kind of varies in terms of different characteristics. For instance, block lengths, degree of sidewalk connectivity within the neighborhood, and connections of houses to kind of the sidewalk system, the style of buildings, how close on average homes are to nearby amenities such as parks, schools, and particularly commercial services, and environmental conditions. That's particularly an issue in like the hilly neighborhoods where you've got steep slopes that affect development feasibility from that standpoint. So we took a look at these different neighborhoods, kind of summarized the conditions there, and ultimately this information will kind of inform how we see development code provisions related to middle housing kind of affecting things on the ground in these different types of neighborhoods. So that's what we've done so far on this context study piece. So again, design and code concepts, we've gotten started on this, and you got the memo. That's kind of our initial summary of what we've found so far. And what we've started to do so far is identify an approach to these design and code concepts that is going to be consistent with the requirements of the House bill and the associated administrative rules. We'll be kind of, again, identifying how the code provisions will ultimately kind of affect things on the ground. One of the things that we talk about in the memo is reducing regulatory barriers to and/or encouraging development of middle housing. So our firm worked with you all about a year ago to do a residential code audit. It looked at all types of housing in the city, not just middle housing, but other types of housing as well. And it identified a number of regulatory barriers just generally to developing different types of housing there. So we pulled that information, some of the key points from that audit into this initial summary of the design and code concepts to identify some barriers that, in addition to simply kind of implementing the House bill, there's some other things we think you could do to update your code to reduce those barriers related to middle housing, and or again, to kind of go potentially above and beyond those minimum state compliance rules to further encourage development of middle housing in the city. And ultimately, it's important to achieve the other community goals and values that you've heard something about already in the presentation, and you'll hear a little bit more about, I think, when you hear the Healthy Democracy presentation. So, next one. So, one of the sort of key, I guess, thrusts of the memo we sent out earlier is our kind of attempt to start to answer what are your options for complying with the HB 2001 legislation and encouraging middle housing? Where do you have more flexibility? Where do you have a little less flexibility? So we've started to kind of lay out some of those kind of policy or I guess at least approach options and choices in that memo. And really, we think also in identifying kind of where you have more or less flexibility in terms of how you move forward, that should inform and focus your outreach efforts in terms of talking to people about what are the choices, what are the options, how can you ask for input from community members in a way that furthers this, but doesn't kind of ask them questions that you can't use the answers to, I guess. You don't want to be asking people for advice on something and then you really just can't use that because you don't have the flexibility in that aspect of the rules. So next one. So kind of a few key topics, again, summarized in the design and code concept summary. One, just, where do you have to be looking at your code and updating your code to address the middle housing requirements and goals? Well, kind of essentially most of your residential zones. So your base zones R1 through R4, as well as most of your special area zones, because those are zones that essentially serve as either residential or mixed use zones. And the OARs are pretty clear that the middle housing requirements apply to those types of zones. There are some definitions where you have some choices you can make related to how you define different types of middle housing. So particularly with duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, you have the ability to define those as either only attached units, which is how most communities have traditionally defined those types of housing, but the administrative rules give you the option of also saying duplexes could be 2 detached units on a single lot. A triplex could be 3 detached units on a single lot. So you have that option to decide how you want to define those things in your code. Cottage clusters, kind of similarly, the model code that was developed around cottage clusters assumes all of those individual cottages are on a single lot, but you could choose, and that's the way the model code regulations or requirements are oriented, but you could choose to also to define them that way, but also to define them as being on their own separate lots or parcels. Each cottage unit could be on its own piece of property. It makes it a little more complicated in terms of coming up with the specific code standards, but it's an option. It does make it easier ultimately for that to be an ownership option in terms of that kind of housing type. So that's something where you've got some flexibility. I already kind of talked about the idea of removing some barriers to middle housing that were identified in that earlier code audit that was done. Just some other places where you have some flexibility or options have to do with how you regulate bulk and scale. So kind of the mass of a house, there's some different options there. As well as some options for how you deal with off-street parking. There are some thresholds within the administrative rules in terms of how many off-street parking spaces you can require of a project within your code. And there's a difference between what you can require and what you can allow. But you also can, you can't require more than a certain number, and it varies a little bit by housing type and in some cases a lot size. You could choose to require even fewer if you thought that was a way to encourage development of middle housing. You can decide whether or not you want to, for instance, provide on-street parking credits under certain circumstances for to meet off-street parking requirements. So there's some different options or flexibility you have related to off-street parking. Let's see, do I have... Oh, okay. I think I started talking about some of this already a little bit, so apologies if I do some repeating here. So just some other options related to design standards. So there's siting standards and there's design standards. Design standards are mostly about kind of the architectural design of a building. So for duplexes, I mentioned this earlier, you really can only apply standards that also apply to single family detached homes. So you have some choices about whether or not you want to adopt some additional standards for single family detached homes and then also apply them to duplexes or not, but that's sort of the basic choice you have there. Triplexes and fourplexes, there are again some I would say kind of baseline design standards in the model code. that you could potentially apply, or you could come up with some custom standards. Right now, your code applies a certain set of design standards to multifamily development, including or I guess including or as well as triplexes and quadplexes. Some of those standards you are likely not going to be able to apply to triplexes and quadplexes. So you're gonna have to kind of split those out within your code and then decide what you do and can apply to triplexes and fourplexes. Row houses, for the most part, you don't currently have specific design standards. So you need to kind of decide, do you want to adopt some new standards for that form of housing? And what's kind of, do you start with the model code or do you come up with some custom standards? And then cottage cluster is kind of somewhat similar. We think you're gonna need to develop or apply some new standards for cottage cluster housing. The model code, again, kind of offers, I think, in my opinion, a pretty good off-the-shelf set of standards, but you've got some ability to take a different path on some of those standards and apply some custom standards of your own for cottage cluster. And I talked earlier about that issue of treating cottage clusters as all the cottages are on a single lot versus they could be on separate lots. And if you were to allow them on separate lots, you need to come up with sort of probably a couple different sets of standards to cover those different situations, or not all the standards would apply to both situations. So let's see, I think, so that was my last slide. So that was a lot of talking. I will stop talking and I will see if y'all have any questions and do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Matt. I see there are several questions here, and I'm going to try to organize our responses in a way that is fair and keeps us moving as we go. I've got Commissioner Borowski first in the queue here, followed by Regula and then Edwards. Commissioner Borowski, are you able to? You look like you might be frozen. So we'll come back to you and we'll go ahead with Commissioner Fragala.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. I found the report that you provided us really useful and can clearly begin to see some trends emerging, which you also summarized here. When you last reported to us on the code audit, we were given a summary document that, for me personally, I love the symbols, the icons, the color. As some of these themes emerge, I'm hoping that we'll have a similar crosswalk that will incorporate the code audit as well as some of the patterns you're starting to discuss, so that we can look at some of the themes that are emerging in relationship to some of the community priorities. My question is about the 5 neighborhood patterns. I personally would assume that when I think of each of those neighborhood patterns, that they make up distinct zones within our city, but I imagine they could also be, a checkerboard pattern. How would you describe them, and do you think it's possible to have a map that actually shows the 5 neighborhood patterns?
That's a really good question. I see Terry unmuted herself, so I wasn't sure if she wanted to take a first shot at that, or Jen, or you want me to try to cover it?
You go ahead, Matt. I was unmuted the whole time.
Okay, I was not a sign, huh? Yeah. So yes, what I would say is that we did work with city staff I'm pretty sure I'm going to get this right. I wasn't sort of the lead on that piece of the work, but we did talk about, and I think develop a map that generally showed how different neighborhoods fit into those 5 different typologies that I mentioned. They do cut across to some degree zoning districts, so there's not really there's not a one-to-one correspondence between neighborhood, typology, and zoning district. It is a little bit more of a, if not quite a checkerboard pattern, at least a pattern where there's a certain amount of a certain amount of overlap. It's not a total like real bad Venn diagram, but there's kind of a mix there. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. We do have some of that information, and we'll be kind of talking about what's the best way to get that information to you. I also just wanted to respond to kind of the first comment you had, because I thought that was a really good comment about one, kind of the symbology and other ways we use to describe the information in the earlier report that we worked on back in 2019, which I wasn't the manager on that one from our firm, but I'm familiar with it. I've spent a fair bit of time looking at it. So that's, as we continue to work on this design and code concepts task, that's one of our next sort of steps, is to augment what we've done with some more graphics that help explain some of these choices and options that we've talked about in the memo that we sent out. And also just to think about how else we can convey that information to people in a broader audience, let's say. I mean, I will say that the memo that we sent out, it's a good, solid sort of code geek kind of format. No offense intended anybody here, but I think what we need to do as part of the next step is just to make that thing more accessible, and graphics and symbols and icons are one way to help do that. So I wanted to respond to that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to Commissioner Borowski to see if you're ready. Are you ready?
Well, I hope so. My connection kind of keeps going in and out. So I guess I had a couple of questions in regards to how some of these things, as far as citing and design standards, gel with other policies that the city has going forward. And I looked at some of your diagrams and things like that, and it seemed to me that they would interact with some things like our access management standards. When we're talking about 3 driveways on a lot, we have the number of curb cuts that can be done. Other things that I was wondering how they would interact with our ability to do this is, I recall when we were looking at like alley access lots for secondary dwelling units, the fire department had issues with length of hoses to get from a fire hydrant. They were worried about those types of things. Are those things that can be applied? Other things like our street design standards, when you're talking about the hilly areas and we're talking about increasing density and stuff, I know we've had issues in the past with some of our unimproved streets and the safety issues. So are those things that we can consider when we're talking about siting and design limitations or not?
So without getting too far down to the weeds, I'm going to say generally yes. So in terms of access management standards, yes, that's certainly something that you can consider as you're looking at how to update standards related to things like curb cuts, driveway width, et cetera. And again, the model code standards related to some of those things are meant to be kind of like, here's one approach to do this that the state has done some vetting on in terms of its impact on imposing or creating unreasonable cost and delay. But you're going to need to look at some of those other types of standards and considerations, alley access as well. In terms of kind of issues associated with topography and let's say public works design or road design standards, there is, you kind of need to treat middle housing the way you treat other housing in that regard. There is some language in the administrative rules that talk about cities can and do need to look at whether or not there is sufficient infrastructure to serve a development when there is an application for that development. So there's some of that language written into those administrative rules. And in fact, part of the definition of sufficient infrastructure has to do with emergency access. So you'll see some of that in there. And ultimately that becomes a development approval decision, not so much a zoning decision, not so much we're going to zone this area and say, no, we can't have middle housing here. It's more about assessing whether or not you have or a developer could help improve the infrastructure to provide sufficient infrastructure in those areas. So that's maybe getting more into the weeds than I needed to. But again, I would say short answer is yes, but within a certain number of sideboards and kind of limitations. So hopefully that helps.
So what you're saying, so like on access management, let's say, if the code for a triplex driveways or row house driveways don't fit our access management plan, we would need to change the access management plan, or it could
not necessarily
stop the development of those.
Yeah, I would say not necessarily. I think there's going to need to be consistency between the two things. And without kind of looking at a specific issue, it's hard for me to say which thing you might have to tweak. I would say those are all things that you can and would need to look at in terms of updating your standards. But exactly how and exactly what got tweaked, it's hard for me to say. So I'm sorry, I can't be a little more specific than that.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Edwards followed by Commissioner Beeson.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Matt. That was really good information, and all this information is awesome. I had a question about one of the provisions that you had mentioned, reasonable cost or delay. And I'm wondering if either you or maybe Terry or somebody can tell me who is determining what is reasonable when it comes to cost or delay in this process.
I will do my best, then we'll see if Terry has anything to add. So yeah, the legislation itself says that the House bill, not just the administrative rules, but the House bill says that cities cannot adopt regulations that have the effect of causing unreasonable cost and delay in the development of middle housing. This was the subject of a lot of discussion during the rulemaking process. Ultimately, the approach that the state took was not to create a definition of what unreasonable cost and delay is. They and we, in the model code process, we looked at some different standards, and we looked at what kinds of impacts those standards might have on the financial feasibility of development, and whether or not we thought those would result in unreasonable cost and delay. Again, we didn't have a super specific definition of that. There's not one in the legislation. And so some of the standards that went into the model code and then ultimately into the administrative rules were, I will say, vetted sort of through that rulemaking process as those things not causing unreasonable cost and delay. And that's why I say some of those design standards are seen as, do you want to use those? Those are great. Those are already vetted. Beyond that, there are some criteria. So beyond that, it's up to the city to make, if the city wants to do something different, if the city, you, Eugene, or anybody else wants to adopt some alternative siting and design standards, alternative to what the OARs explicitly define or allow, or what's in the model code, you need to make the findings that they won't cause unreasonable cost and delay. And there is some guidance in terms of some criteria within the administrative rules about how you would do that, or what kinds of findings you would have to make related to that. But that's sort of the approach they took. So it's kind of on you to determine whether or not those standards would result in that unreasonable cost and delay, with some guidance or criteria within the administrative rules. So still kind of fuzzy, I will say. Terry, was that a reasonable? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Okay, I've got Commissioner Beeson, and I've got a couple of questions of my own.
Okay, and I want to be brief. I have a comment and a quick question. I also, Matt, well, I appreciate all the material so far, both staff and from Matt. So Matt, I've been trying to follow this stuff for several months as it's been kind of coming up through the state. I follow the stuff with the Healthy Democracy panel. I'd particularly call out your presentation to them for people. I think it was very helpful to me. I really did like your backgrounder. I'm probably going to go through it a couple of times. I know that we're going to talk about this material more in more detail in January. So I'm assuming we'll hear from you and or your colleagues and others then. Anyway, I appreciate it. My question, and I don't need to, just maybe kind of a brief response. The whole thing of it's already been asked a bit on the housing patterns. The context study caught my eye, and the 5. I'm assuming what you guys are saying is that all residential housing in Eugene falls into one of those categories. And assuming that's true, I was kind of, a lot of them looked a little bit specific to me. And then the post-war seemed to cover a lot of years, assuming that's World War II, and a lot of housing. So, in fact, even a range of housing. So I guess I'm just asking, is that true? It covers it all? And that post-war is meant to cover all these kind of 70 years worth of subdivisions?
So it looks like Terry does want to take this one, which
But I jump in? Yeah. I just wanted to iterate something that Matt already said when he was talking about the context study, and that is that the ultimate purpose of it is to help us understand how the different code regulations are going to take shape on the ground, because not every neighborhood in Eugene is the same. They've been developed over time. But I would also add that when we originally wrote the scope for the context study, HB 2001 had not yet been through the rulemaking process. And so we had envisioned it as a way to think about different neighborhoods and potentially propose different standards for different neighborhoods. And that's not really on the table anymore. And so what we have now is a good background piece of information that helps us understand development patterns. But the focus has shifted to how are the rules going to logistically, for example, on hills or in flag lots or different kinds of neighborhood patterns going to take shape. I hope that helps.
So I don't need to get too hung up on those 5 categories. Thanks.
Yeah, I would not get super hung up on them.
All right.
I think I am not exactly sure the answer to like how much of the housing stock that post-war. I don't think it's sort of everything forward to that. I think there is, again, some overlap between some of those other categories, or not overlap, but there's a chunk of housing built post-war that's in those other typologies, if that makes sense.
It's fine. I think you guys addressed what I'm good. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, I have, like I suggested, I have 2 things. One's more of a comment or maybe a request or suggestion. As you go ahead with the work, it's terrific what you've done, and the fact that you have this huge breadth of experience statewide, and even here in Eugene, really helps us a lot. And I'm sort of following up on what Commissioner Fragula said about ways that you can give us information that help us sort it out as we go forward. I too really appreciated those graphical representations and that go around on the thing before about codes and barriers to housing. So with that in mind, the 2 things occur to me. One is, as soon as possible, create this as if it is Eugene's. So when I look at the DLCD or the OARs and I look at 14 pages, a lot of those are not going to apply to Eugene. So the faster we can kind of get to, well, what does this mean to us? I think the better. And I know that I know because you're working statewide, you'll have to continually do that. But I think the fewer it says, well, that doesn't, a community could do that. Well, if we can't do that, then, don't go there. Because honestly, we're so overwhelmed with the information that's coming to us right now. The faster it can be narrowed, I think, the better. And along with that, if there's a way to quickly is not quite the right word, but consistently integrate the principles that are coming out of the focus groups and the public. I know we have a lot of sorting and a lot of work to do on those, but there are going to be, you must have already seen some trends. And so the sooner you can bring those into your work and say, this is how, if you did A, it would allow you not to do this or to do that. Because that's a part of where we're gonna have a matrix which says, well, how many of these principles does this test? Because that's, I think, how we're gonna do a lot of our decision making. And we really need to understand in every way possible what the public is telling us about this. This issue touches everyone who lives in the city because most of us live in a structure. Many do not. And the ones that are not in structures, then this is a way for them to get into structures. So it touches absolutely everyone. So very critical to be sure we cover that. So those are my suggestions / comments. I do have one question about incentives. And what I heard you mention parking as a possible incentive. What other kinds of incentives do you think are out there that would allow us as a community to incentivize things that we think add to livability or aid in affordability that maybe go beyond the model rules?
Okay, so I'll first just really briefly respond to the comments, and then I'll give you my best, at least initial shot on the incentives question. It's a good question. One, just appreciate the comments and absolutely agree with your suggestions. I think we've already kind of started talking about some of those things. I think, as I have looked at some of the initial work on the guiding principles, I think we're thinking along the same lines of those guiding principles would be things we'd look at as we look at different code or design options and say, is this option consistent with or achieving that principle or not? And that's got to be one of the things that guides our work moving forward. So I would absolutely agree with that. And also just with, yes, we need to make this, what can be done in Eugene, what makes sense for Eugene, not just kind of anywhere around the state. In terms of kind of incentives, I'll give you my kind of what tends to be my typical spiel in terms of the things that I think are most often used or considered as incentives. They tend to be things that are really gonna impact kind of the bottom line in terms of the cost of developing housing. So parking is almost always going to be one of them because there's a real cost to providing additional parking spaces, particularly if that parking is in a structured or covered space versus just, but even if it's just using area on a property, that still has a potential impact on the feasibility of development. So parking is kind of one of the top ones. Height and density, I mean, those are other things that clearly affect financial feasibility of a certain types of development. So those are ones. Fees, fee reductions for certain types of housing. I mean, that's always going to be, and I'm thinking about things that are not just your kind of land use permitting review fees, but more things like systems development charges, and I know it's really hard to kind of often think about reducing those things because you need those things to be able to build the infrastructure. But if you're thinking about things that have an impact on the cost of development, that's another one. And then the last one I would just mention would be from a kind of quality of life sort of standpoint, incentives around provision of public or private open space. Is another one to sort of think about in terms of incentives. So that's my quick list of things that I tend to think about in terms of incentives when we look at incorporating those things in our development code. And Terry has some other ideas, or maybe.
Thank you, Matt. No, that was great discussion. I didn't want to interrupt it, but we have some time constraints on the Healthy Democracy panelists that are here. So we're going to have to shift to them. And I don't know if you're able to stick around in case there are more questions at the end. Okay, great, Matt. Thank you. If that's okay, sorry, Commissioner Ramey, to steal the meeting from you, but I want to turn it over to Lynn from Healthy Democracy. Go ahead, Lynn.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having us here. You're going to hear a little bit from me and then from a couple of panelists, members of the review panel. So I'm the program manager for Healthy Democracy. And I just wanted to take a 10,000-foot view first of sort of what this process is versus other public engagement. It's sort of, as we think of it, one of several pieces of the democracy pie We have engagement that's open to everyone. That's surveys and public comment and voting, for example. It's fairly broad, but not terribly deep. We have special invitation that, the other kinds of, a lot of the other kind of engagement involved in this process, stakeholder engagement of boards and commissions, or equity panels, youth panels, things like that, that are deep, but for a specific sort of group. And then we have sort of what this piece is, which is random invitation. It is open or with a chance for anyone to participate if they get the letter and respond to it and are then randomly selected, but also deep once you're on that panel and a representation of the city. But this isn't quite the best metaphor, because really we're talking about expanding the democracy pie, not splitting it up into different pieces. It's not a finite resource. And in honor of it being the holiday season, more pie for everyone. So this is how this pie is constructed. I just wanted to give a quick overview of sort of the different pieces of this. At the center of it is the review panel itself. 29 members who are reflective of the city on a number of different demographics. But around it, there's a lot of people sort of supporting the panel and its work. There's us, of course, and all of our staff. There's city staff. There's third-party evaluators. These are experts from our peer practitioners from, I think, 5 different countries around the world who've been watching different stages of the process. There's the steering committee, on which 2 of your members sit. And there are, of course, outside presenters who present to the panel at various points. So I'll go through these pretty quickly, but there's sort of several ways that the panel is supported by us, of course, by the steering committee, and importantly, by the panel itself. We've created these sort of internal panel subcommittees where it does a lot of its own staff support, essentially, in terms of evaluating information, working with words and oversight of the process. Information comes into the panel from city staff, from these outside presenters, as I mentioned, some of which were chosen in advance by the steering committee, some of which were chosen by the panel itself from a very long menu prepared by the steering committee of lots of different options. And importantly, and equally important to outside information, is the experience of panelists themselves. After all, this is a really unique cross-section of the city of Eugene, and there is an incredible amount of wisdom in that room already. Recommendations come out of the panel to city staff, as you know, and we help publicize them. And then final slide here, there's a lot of oversight mechanisms here. Of course, a lot of it's directed at us because we are sort of the main support staff and our various process folks. And oversight is coming from us, ourselves, staff, these evaluators, the steering committee, the panel via its process oversight committee, and the panel is being reviewed by us, by its own committee, and by the evaluators. So there's sort of a lot of interlocking pieces here. You can see this whole sort of diagram later on if you want to look at the slides. Just a little background again on who the panel is, where it was selected from. So we took 7,500 randomly selected residential addresses throughout the city and its urban growth boundary, sent out letters back in October, I believe. Then did a selection process, which you can see online on the project website, where we did a second round of random selection from folks who responded, resulted in a panel of actually 30, but there was one person who dropped out. So we're at 29 residents aged 16 and up, rather, reflective of the city on a number of different demographic factors here on the right. This is what it looks like when you have the city of Eugene in one virtual room. A microcosm of the city. It's pretty cool, and would encourage you to go back and take a peek at some of the full group sessions if you'd like, or attend them in the spring. Speaking of the spring, there's sort of 2 different main parts of this project, and this is really exciting to us because it's the first time that we've had sort of this level of feedback loops, and the city sort of willing to put itself out there to get this level of feedback on a major project like this. And I should say, this is the first time in Oregon that a city has used a lottery selected deliberative panel on a major planning project. So kudos to you, and thank you so much for your support. After I haven't talked to you since we met about a year ago. But in any case, two sort of main parts here. The first part It was in 3 parts within itself. These background experts selected by the steering committee, an exploration of panelist experiences, the panel then selecting its own folks that it wanted to hear from, about 20 outside folks presented to the panel in total. And then the final few sessions, the panel spent in deliberation, working through drafting these principles and working with them in iterative small groups and then prioritizing them together into a list. In the spring, the panel will return in mid-February to review draft code concepts and then begin some overall public engagement evaluation and then return again in mid-April to look at draft code concepts and sort of complete that engagement evaluation. You can see the whole report. I think you have a copy of it actually, but for everybody else, it's on the project website at healthydemocracy.org/Eugene. And here in a moment, the 2 panelists who've joined us, Sam and Hunter, will be reading the first 10, is what they decided they'd like to read, of the first 10 principles in the list. I just add that if you look at sort of the vote counts throughout the document, I believe all of the principles got at least 60% support from the panel, and most much more than that. These are all things that the panel sort of worked on over time and together. And that's part of sort of the deliberative process is to work to build principles that most people can agree on, and I think that's reflected here. But of course, they are listed in order of priority still by the panel. I also just really quickly wanted to point you, if you want more information on all the nerdy aspects of sort of the internal workings of the process, we've produced, or in the process of producing, a video series. The first 3 episodes are out, and you can find the link on that same project site with into the detail of the selection process and folks that are working on software to do that, into myself and my co-moderator Alex, for 40 minutes on sort of the internal theory behind the deliberations in the room, et cetera, if you want that kind of detail. And there's the info one more time. And with that, I'm going to turn it straight over to Sam and Hunter to read the first 10 principles of the panel, and then talk a little bit about their experience. I think they have a few things they'd like to say so far on the panel. I'll just say that neither I nor them can speak on behalf of the panel, of course. The report speaks for itself, and it is the work of 29 people, but I'm sure they would be happy to answer as many questions as they can from their personal experience. And with that, Sam and Hunter, the floor is yours. And I'll just go through the list of principles here.
Can we stop screen sharing so we can see the panelists?
I can't actually, because they have to read off the screen to read the first 10 principles. But then then I'll turn it off.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Or thanks for letting us on, rather. I'll just kind of start here with the first principle, and that is affordable housing is of paramount importance. Second one is provision for continuous improvement of policy. What we create will need to be revisited in the future. Establish a periodic form of review process on existing policy to change accordingly. Form a review process that is at least as representative as this panel. Expedite the process. Number 3, expedite the process of securing affordable housing for those that need it most. Reduce red tape. Number 4, maintain affordability for newly constructed middle housing when replacing existing affordable housing structures. And 5, zoning codes need to serve the needs of the general population.
Sam, I think you're on mute.
I am Sam. This is number 6. Rentals need to be affordable and habitable and accessible. Number 7 is refrain from tearing down existing habitable, affordable housing and discourage replacing it with higher cost housing. Number 8, protect and preserve our natural resources such as the Amazon headwaters and features our city holds dear, as well as open spaces, green spaces, playgrounds, and gathering spaces, especially for children. Number 9, build for the foreseeable future. Age and demographics are changing. And lastly, but not least, number 10, address homelessness with practical solutions like tiny homes, transitional housing, and townhomes. More parks of tiny homes like Emerald Park or cottage clusters for homeless individuals, something that gives a homeless person a sense of dignity and a place they can call their own. So those are the first 10. I think now Hunter and I will speak on our experiences. Yes? Perfect. So Hunter and I were actually a part of a larger group of individuals who basically decided to, in order to capture really, the experiences of all the panelists and, the emotions associated with being a part of something bigger than themselves, their motivations for joining it, we decided to come together to create a testimonial type video. So we interviewed a number of voluntary panelists, I suppose, those who wanted to be interviewed, and asked them a number of questions, just kind of like wondering why, where they were in life, what kinds of experiences they brought to the table, if they thought their voice was heard, which most obviously did, what the coolest parts of being on the panel was for them or were for them, and just kind of what their takeaways would be, what the most inspiring parts were. For me, I would say it was just really remarkable to be in a group of, an incredibly diverse group of people from all sorts of backgrounds, demographics, lived experiences, and to see how beautifully it all comes together, where everyone can share their own experiences. Nobody, everybody's very respectful of one another in the same space. And, not everyone's always in agreement, but we all kind of are able to find our way through that and, have our voice and respectfully listen to other voices. So it was really cool how that all kind of worked together. I think it was a really successful and fluid process. It was also really cool to learn from other people's experiences, and just know that, there's so much, so many different perspectives out there than your own. I think that's always a really cool thing to be a part of. And yeah, it just really feels empowering, I would say.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of add in here. I was also on the panel with Sam, and really, the whole process for me anyway so far has been really remarkable. It's been very rewarding and also empowering for me, because we're actually, this kind of process, I think, shows that, hey, government works. And, I really hope that the city of Eugene and other local governments will kind of continue to put together these sorts of panels, because I think they're really healthy to have in society in general, especially just for democracy in times that, people are losing faith in our process. From my perspective anyway, I think this has been a very just remarkable thing that's come together. I just want to say thank you to everybody that put this together, planned it, came up with the idea. It's amazing. I've met a lot of great individuals on this panel that have contributed quite a lot of different perspective that I obviously did not have. But I felt like I also was able to bring a lot of what I had to say to the table as well. So.
Thanks to you both. And with that, I guess we'll take questions.
Thank you all. That was a really terrific presentation. Very interesting, exciting, and engaging. Thank you for your work. I've got Commissioner Beeson up first here.
So brief comment. I'm on the steering committee along with Commissioner Bragala. I've this experience from kind of my position of observing the panel online to be pretty rewarding. I like what you guys are doing. I'm appreciating Sam and Hunter and the other, I guess, 27 panelists on what you're doing. I also would call out, and I guess to my colleagues and to others who are listening, and this was attached to the material that Terry sent out, but there's been quite a list of presenters who presented, and they sent it out with some handy links to allow you to get to it. And I would encourage people, if you have time and the inclination, a number of these presenters are well, they're informative and kind of from start to finish. They build I found a pretty good foundation for what this is all about, what we're doing, why we're doing it, kind of how it's going to go. And I would just, if you have some time, encourage you to follow some of the links. Going in and even listening to some of the panel discussion is informative and pretty rewarding. So I would leave it at that. I think it's been good work. Thanks.
Commissioner Borofsky.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn and Hunter and Sammy. Very exciting process here. I think this is a new type of public engagement process that the city's going into. And just for us to consider, and also I'd love hearing from the commissioners that are actually on the steering committee as well. This is great. We're charged by state statute. We are the public engagement committee for the city of Eugene when it comes to this type of land use type of things. So what we get to do is listen and digest all of your guys' great feedback and then have to kind of craft it into and make it go into code. So I saw a few things on there that are great and aspirational that I definitely feel are things that we want to strive for, but may not necessarily be able to attain because of some of the things that are written in the HB 2001. I don't want to see an affordable housing, a house that may be a single family house get torn down to put up an expensive quad or something like that. But yet we may be limited by the state law. So that's kind of where our role comes in. We take the public feedback from as many people as we can and help staff craft that into what will actually work and be a legal code. So I'm really excited about getting the feedback from you guys, but also want you to realize that sometimes there are constraints that we can't necessarily follow through on all of those recommendations just because of constraints that were put into by state law and those types of things. But I really appreciate you guys' input. Thank you.
Commissioner Fregula.
Thank you. Somebody put my hand down. Thanks. So Sammy and Hunter, first off, thank you very much for joining us today. And I also served on the steering committee, so it's been really interesting to track the panel. You got to read the top 10 priorities that were chosen by the panel. I'm curious if there is something that personally really stood out for you that you would like to talk about.
That's a great question, and I appreciate it. I will go first and then send it over to Hunter if he has anything to say. But yeah, as a young person, I'm also a student at the University of Oregon. Affordable housing isn't necessarily something I've given a lot of thought to, given the fact that I'm a renter. I need, basically what's cheapest and the most possible for me to get my hands on in order to do what I need to. So I have obviously been, struck by a lot of, oh my goodness, that's a little too expensive, or how am I supposed to come up with that kind of money? And so even just recognizing those issues, not necessarily in the name of purchasing a house, but just as a renter, as a tenant, as a young person, as a student, there are a lot of factors there that make it really difficult to access high quality, habitable, affordable housing. And those are all factors that come into play. It's not just housing. There's so many other things that are necessary in order for it to be livable. And fortunately, I am an able-bodied individual, so that makes it a little bit more possible for me to find livable housing. And so I do, I've been starting to realize with my experience on this panel how, not ubiquitous housing might be for people that might have physical disabilities, and also, that it seems sometimes to be a little bit arbitrary. Like, I have been looking into other housing. I'm looking into like a 1-bedroom. I currently share a 4-bedroom flat with other roommates, and it actually comes out to be, in certain areas cheaper than a 4-bedroom flat, and then in some areas it's a few $100s more expensive. So it's kind of interesting in that regard and with my perspective, just because I am starting to realize some inconsistencies in, like housing costs, I suppose, and also in the way that I'm able to access housing. And so I think that one of the, I would say, there's so many of them that spoke to me, but anything that had to do with, affordability, anything that had to do with renters and tenants, those were all very, aligned with my needs. And I felt that, they really represented the struggles that a lot of lower income younger people and students have in searching for housing that's habitable, right? Because we often find ourselves in, dumpy apartments that, we can afford, but they're not necessarily the best quality, or, we have to make ends meet and afford food otherwise. So there's just a lot of factors there. And I think that there's definitely a need for, actual low income housing that people that would otherwise be moving into the non-existent middle housing, are currently taking up. And so moving that kind of along and providing low income housing for actual low income people that's of quality, that's livable, that's habitable, is definitely a huge priority and needs to happen more often.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add on here. Obviously the affordability aspect is something that, was really important to me, as well as, a couple of key takeaways I discovered in this process were just the complexity to the issue of trying to solve the housing crisis in Oregon, let alone in, your different municipalities. There's no clear answer is what I kind of got out of it. And I was happy to see at least something that stood out to me was the effort towards sustainability, as well as inclusivity, making sure that every member of the community is going to be included in policy. For me, obviously, I'm pretty passionate about the environment, and also making sure I kind of bring a youth perspective as well as Sam. I just graduated college from the university, and now that I'm out there on my own for real, out of student housing, that offered some more opportunity to have a little more affordability. Now that I'm out into the actual trying to rent apartments in Eugene, it's a challenge, especially as a young guy that, I'm working as much as I can be right now. The pandemic's kind of, done some real damage there too. But, we have loans to think about, and at least a lot of students that I know do. So kind of getting out there is challenging for sure. So I think those are the things that really stood out to me, and also just to see how bold of initiatives people wanted to try to put through to say, hey, we know there's only so much we can do, but we should really try to push the envelope a little bit and try to enact some really good change. And obviously a lot of that can be a little too optimistic at this point in time, but I think it's something that we can strive for. So.
Thank you both.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. I just, Lynn and Sammy and Hunter, particularly Sammy and Hunter, thank you for your enthusiasm and taking time today to be with us, time out of your days. It's terrific. I think you're well on your way to becoming citizens, model citizens that we can all emulate as we go forward in our lives, because volunteering is time consuming, as you know. So thank you very much for your time. Lynn, maybe a quick question for you. As I glanced through this list, it looked like there were maybe 42 principles. I didn't do an exhaustive look, but somewhere in the 40s. And these were the top 10. And it says something about a weighted score. Could you talk briefly about that, and how can you translate it into percentage, or how do we know at what, or maybe you can give us this list numbered differently so we can get a sense of, well, what these things were like super important, and actually, you know, up to 12 was important, but we only had time for 10. You know, well, how do we do that?
Yeah, sure. So I know the way that I numbered it in there is maybe a little bit confusing. It was sort of to call back to the numbers that were used in the process itself in case there needed to be cross-referencing. But they are in order of priority, and you'll see on the first page it sort of has a little list of how the weighting worked. So there was a survey or a poll done at the end of the process where the panelists rated each one in terms of strongly agree, somewhat agree, don't know or neutral, and disagree, and those got +2, +1, 0, or -1 points attached to them, basically. And then those added up, and the weighting was just because there were a few people that didn't vote on different ones through the process. So to give them all sort of the same average score, basically, is what the weighting is. So when you read the weighted score, it's sort of the average score per panelist is one way to think of it, I think. So as you look through there, I mean, as you'll see, those weighted scores are in the 1 to 2 range, a lot of them going. So you can see that there was a lot of support for a lot of them. As you get down toward the bottom, maybe there wasn't quite as much support. You know, a lot more people said somewhat agree instead of strongly agree. And that was sort of meant to be a little bit of a guide as in terms of which ones are most important. But as I said, all of them on that list have quite a high level of general support. So yeah, which is not, you know, that's sort of the purpose of a deliberative kind of process, is for folks to work together over in iterative small groups to kind of try to craft the principles with the most possible agreement. So it should not be surprising that a lot of them have a lot of support.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thanks so much.
Terry, I think we're back to you now.
Great, thanks again, Lynn, Sammy, and Hunter for coming and joining us. You're welcome to stay on. But we're going to finish the presentation. There's just a few more slides, and then I think Matt has stayed on also and can answer any more questions that you have. So I'll share my screen again. Okay, just coming back to the economic feasibility study, Matt mentioned this briefly, but to remind you what's going on, Equi-Northwest is taking a look at how economic and development factors vary across the city of Eugene, and coming up with a high level estimate of the likelihood of middle housing developing in different areas over time. So that work is underway, and when it's complete, the study will include results of a test of feasibility of different middle housing prototypes. Again, the estimate of likelihood of it developing in different areas over time, and also help identify areas that might be subject to infrastructure constraints. And that is analysis that city staff will do once we have the report from Equi-Northwest. Quick reminder here, we already have a model code in place, and the deadline we're working towards is June 30th, 2022 to adopt a Eugene specific code. If we don't adopt one that's compliant, or it's appealed and remanded or something like that, the model code will take effect directly on that date. So next steps. As we've talked about over the course of this presentation, we've given you a ton of material, and we fully recognize that there's a lot of reading to do for your holidays. So with the amount of information that you have and that you've heard from all these different groups, we have scheduled a second meeting to come back to Planning Commission on January 12th to look at the guiding principles and values that have begun to be suggested, either in a prioritized format like Healthy Democracy has done, or staff will be putting together some recommendations based on our work with the boards and commissions, the local partners roundtable, the equity roundtable, and the student outreach. So a lot of things need to be distilled over the next month or so. And then we'll also take another deep dive into the next phase of technical work in January. We'll be going to the City Council to present them with an update on public engagement and the technical overview at the end of January. And then I think I just walked through these last 2 points. So that is the summary, and we're doing great on time. We have as much time as you need. Meeting doesn't end until 1:30. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Terry. I see Commissioner Borowski. Yes.
Thank you. Terry, can you help me figure out how to move forward with the constraints that we have? Because I know we're going to get a lot of input regarding the values. You know, we don't want to tear down houses, certain types of houses, to build more expensive types of duplexes. We know that there's neighborhoods. Once we get the Eco Northwest thing, we know that there's going to be neighborhoods that are more likely to develop because of housing costs that pencil out better for developers. And I'm just wondering, how are we, and yet we have a state mandate that's very prescriptive. So we're getting all of this great community input of what we want to see, but it seems to me that the state language is really prescriptive and isn't going to allow us to input a lot of that community input into a code, because it says you have to do this. And if it affects the price or, you know, undue costs, you can't put it in there. So can you help me square how we're going to be able to take all of this valuable community input and shove it into a very prescriptive state law?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and put very concisely. I would say 2 things. I would acknowledge that the state law is prescriptive and that the goal of the House bill is to open up zoning. And so that's kind of the overall goal, is to allow housing in more places. And then there's a bunch of rules that go under that. I do want to point out there are a number of places where we have flexibility, and Matt can jump in and help me with some of those if needed. But there are places where the city definitely has a choice, whether to go with a minimum compliance standard or to do something else that is deemed reasonable. And then the other thing I would say is that we as a city have the ability to look beyond what's required by the law, because we deliver services across a whole range of topics, including affordable housing and programs that are administered by our community development staff, for example, or neighborhood matching grants, or, you know, the list is kind of long in terms of other things that we could promote to meet values and principles that go beyond the narrow requirements of the law. I think I'll leave it at that and let Matt jump in if I've missed something obvious. Oh, yes, I wanted to mention economic incentives. There are actually 3 things that are called out in the law in terms of making sure that housing is affordable. So the cities are directed to look at SDC reductions. There's 3 things, and Lauren ticked them off the other day, so maybe Lauren can pop in too if I forget. But SDCs was one of them. Construction excise tax was another one. And Lauren, what's the third one?
Some property tax incentives.
So those are things the city already does, but they are areas where we could increase what we're doing currently, is how I would answer that as well.
And could we tie those to affordability? would it be possible, and this would be for you, Lauren, could we say, if we give you an SDC waiver, you're going to have it at 80% AMI for 20 years or something like that? Is that something that we could do?
Commissioner Brodsky, it's a great question. I think my answer to you is going to be a lot like Matt's answer from earlier, which is it's going to depend a little bit on the specific regulation and the specific incentive and what exactly you want to do. But I think as a general, the city has the opportunity to allow more than is required by House Bill 2001. And if the city does that, then those sort of extra benefits could be tied to a particular type of development that the city is interested in. For example, affordable housing.
And just since Terry asked me to chime in if I had more to say, I don't really have much to add to what Terry said earlier and to what I said earlier as well. I think I would just emphasize, as Lauren just did and Terry just did, that to some degree the House bill sets sort of a floor and you can go above that floor. Or you can think of it as a ceiling. In some cases, you can go be under the ceiling, right? I mean, if you want to do things that expand choice or make it easier to develop certain types of middle housing, then you have the ability to do that. A lot of the prescriptiveness is around making sure that you don't limit the ability to develop that type of housing in certain locations or on certain size lots, or that you don't require things that add to the cost and delay. But if you want to do things that reduce the cost or reduce some of the requirements, that's one kind of set of options you have. And with a number of the things that I talked about earlier in terms of specific choices that we can look at, that's sort of one of the choices you can make. And I think that's where we would look at some of those guiding principles in terms of asking ourselves, where would we land on this choice in terms of this principle? So that's the only thing I would have to add.
Okay, commissioners, anything else here? We have this great audience. I would say from my point, back to Commissioner Borowski's, it's affordability. Sometimes there's a straight line between size and cost. Sometimes if it gets too small, then it gets too expensive, but there's got to be some middle ground here somewhere. And I'm hoping that the Echo Northwest study can inform us on that. I know some other communities have actually put in place, or at least they talked about putting in place the very scenario Commissioner Borowski was talking about, tearing down a smaller unit and building a much larger unit, which doesn't help your affordability, but is allowed under what we're doing. So just thinking about strategies around affordability and the cost of construction, and maybe leveraging the Echo Northwest work to answer those questions. Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you. I just wanted to commend staff on the amount of thought that has gone into the public input process so far. I feel like we're at a great starting point to have had all of this input from the citizens panel, from the equity panel, from commissioners and councils, as well as other stakeholders. I know it doesn't apply to the actual implementation of HB 2001, but I think to hear young people in our community expressing excitement about planning and an increased, I'm trying to think of the word that Hunter said, an increased confidence in the democratic process is an exceptional outcome to have from this, and one that is greatly desired by public government throughout the United States. So thank you very much for the work that has been done, in addition to the rest of the public input process that will occur. I did hear someone ask earlier, how will the principles be utilized in steering the process forward? And I would include not just the Healthy Democracy panel, but all of the other stakeholder groups that have already been convened.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Thank you. I also want to commend staff for this. It's incredibly informative. The question I had, and I don't know if it is kind of a collaborative one for staff and the panelists as well, is part of the discussion or analysis looking at how our county rates with other counties in terms of the fees to get these developments off the ground, and whether there's any recommendations on what things we can kind of streamline and make more or do away with or improve on that can facilitate faster development if it is in the area of affordable housing.
It's a good question. I would say that we do have an incredible resource in Angela Planning Group because they are working with communities all over the state. In addition to that, the work that Equa Northwest is doing for us, we'll look at available tools and fee reductions that we could propose. And they also have that statewide knowledge. So I think that's a great question that we will be able to be looking at. Anything to add, Matt?
Nope, I think that's a good answer. And our firm, in terms of kind of fees, our firm also does development permitting for a lot of public clients, but some private ones around the state as well. Most of that's in the Portland area, but we do have a pretty good sense of what some of those fees are in different communities around the state. So yeah, if there's information on that we can help provide, then we're happy to do that. So.
Okay, I think it's time to move on to the good of the order section of our agenda. Item C, items from staff. What do you have for us today?
I just have a couple of quick things. I just want to give you an update on what your meeting schedule looks like for the next week or so. So tomorrow night, you do have a public hearing on a land use appeal. And then Thursday, which is an odd day for you and an odd time, you'll start your deliberations for that land use appeal, and that meeting is at noon. So just a reminder about that. And then if you're unable to finish deliberations that day, you'll continue on Monday the 21st, which has an early start time as well. We're also hopeful that we can bring back the clear and objective code amendments on Monday, the 21st, and not with the new stuff that Janessa is seeking feedback on from other staff and working through, but with the continuation of the list. We had some good momentum going at last week's meeting, and we'd like to continue on the 21st, if at all possible. And then we'll be looking for another date in January to wrap those up. One of the things that struck us at the last meeting was after Commissioner Taylor asked about the timeline, we realized if we waited until January for everything, that would throw the timeline pretty far off, just given what council's schedule ends up being. And so we want to try to keep on that schedule to the extent possible. Although you are scheduled for a meeting on the Monday, the 28th, we're going to go ahead and cancel that one. We don't have any items for you or staff available. So we'll be canceling that one. And then your first meeting at this point of the new year, we'll be back here with Middle Housing. I'm going to guess Matt Hasty will be here as well with us. And then just a heads up that we're going to be sending you 2 more polls, one for an additional date for clear and objective in January. And then before Commissioner Borowski asked me about it, yes, we're sending out a poll for the retreat as well. And we will get that on the books for early 2021 as well. And I don't know if you have any other questions for me, but that's kind of how your schedule's lining up, and we'll get you an updated schedule sent to you.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thanks, Alyssa. I just had a question about the hearing tomorrow and deliberations 2 days later. A lot of times when we have a public hearing, there's a request to keep the record open. Is that something that we won't be asking for? Or I'm just checking the process, because if we're closing the public hearing and going into deliberations 2 days later, is that a different procedure than normal?
I'm going to turn it over to Lauren for that one.
Thanks, Alyssa. So Commissioner Borowski, great question. This is an appeal hearing, so there's no requirement that the record be left open, unlike sometimes you've been when Planning Commission holds the initial public hearing on an application, which for this application happened before the hearing is official, there are state statutes that require that the record be left open for a certain period of time if anyone requests it. Because this is not the initial public hearing, those don't apply, and so it's completely up to the Planning Commission as to whether or not you would like to leave the record open if that is requested. I don't have the actual dates in front of me, but I will say that my understanding is that for this application, we are running up very close to the 120-day deadline. And so without an extension from the applicant, which is completely at the applicant's discretion, they don't have to give us any time extensions, we don't have enough time to leave the record open and stay within that 120-day deadline. And Althea will be available to the planner, on this application will be available to talk to you in more detail about all of that with dates and times tomorrow night.
Thanks. That's kind of what I figured, but I also wanted to put it out there for some of the newer members of the Planning Commission. It's like, well, weren't the rules like this last time? And I kind of understood that we were probably hitting the 120.
Commissioner Franklin. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I have just two quick things, but I can do it after questions.
Commissioner Fragola.
Yeah, I can probably find it, but I was wondering about sharing the middle housing barrier study, the 2019 code audit. I think that would be really useful information for any of the commissioners that weren't with us when we reviewed that. And if you're going to send it out anyway, I'd love if you sent it to me. 'Cause I'm pretty sure I have it, but I might have to dig a little while.
We can make sure that gets sent out. And just real quick, I will not be at tomorrow night's meeting. Gabe is going to be covering that on my behalf. There's another planning related meeting that poses a conflict. And then also at your Thursday meeting, and this is more for the public because you'll be on Zoom, but Metro TV is also covering 2 other meetings at that same time on Thursday. So we will have the live stream webcast, but it will not make it onto the local public access TV at the same time. So if your friends like to watch, just let them know they should be watching on the webcast. And that's all I have.
Okay, good to know. With that, I see we are 1 minute ahead of our scheduled time to meet. And I think the staff and the vice chair and I should get full credit for that 1 minute. And I'm going to adjourn us before it expires. So I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a good day.
Thank you.